It's been nearly a full year since The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom finally made its way to the Nintendo Switch, which is still kinda crazy for me to think about. We went through a global pandemic, many months of Nintendo news droughts, a spin-off, a remake, and countless predictions and theories from practically every corner of the Zelda fanbase. And now it's just here, closing in on its 1-year anniversary. Naturally, this brings up the very logical question of, now what? What's next for the series and what can we expect to see from it in the future? Obviously, I don't have the answers to those questions because, to my dismay, my dad does not work at Nintendo. My dog does, but unfortunately there's a bit of a language barrier. Dino, when is the next Zelda game? In all seriousness though, trying to predict what the next Zelda will bring and when is like trying to predict the weather half a decade from now. Zelda is like the Spanish Inquisition in that regard. Nobody expected that Ocarina of Time would end up getting a strange, almost art house-like sequel just over a year later, or that these two games would be followed up by this, and then this. In short, every time we think we have some sense of direction for the future of the series, it goes and does something completely different again. So instead of trying to guess what the next game could be, I'm just gonna present my own personal hopes and wishes for the series moving forward. These will include dungeons, the combat system, the open world, and anything else I can think of. And since I have a bit of a nasty habit of over-explaining things and getting sidetracked, I've decided to focus on one topic at a time as opposed to cramming it all into one massive video. A little mini-series if you will. And today we are going back to the roots of the channel and discuss the future of Zelda Dungeons. Before we begin though, I do want to emphasize that these are all just my personal takes, which may or may not align with yours. The franchise has such a wide appeal at this point that there's a very good chance that you enjoy Zelda for very different reasons than I do. And I am in no way trying to take anything away from anyone. Not that I have any authority on these matters to begin with, but you know, just putting that out there. I also highly encourage each and every one of you to share your thoughts and ideas in the comments below so others and I can get as many different perspectives as possible. The only thing I ask is that we keep it civil because at the end of the day it is just a video game and most of this stuff is purely subjective. But enough with the introduction, let's dive straight into it. It's no secret at this point that dungeons are one of my favorite aspects of the Zelda experience and gaming as a whole for that matter. They've managed to capture my excitement and imagination from a very young age, and as far as quality goes, I would argue that Zelda's dungeon design has been one of the most consistent aspects in the franchise since pretty much its inception. I've played a lot of games in practically every genre, and I struggle to think of another franchise that has been as revolutionary, diverse, and just flat out genius in regards to how dungeons are designed and what you can do with them. I cannot even begin to list all the incredible things they've managed to come up with over the years. The unique central mechanics, the mobility options, the physics-defying puzzles. I mean, the first time I saw that twisted hallway in Ocarina of Time, my 11-year-old brain just exploded. Naturally, not every Zelda dungeon is gonna be an absolute banger, but it is safe to say that for almost every installment, you can count on at least one or two that will leave a long-lasting impression. In short, Zelda Dungeons have it all. The complexity, the ingenuity, the difficulty in some cases, a variety of enemies and mini-bosses, great rewards in the form of new items which expand your capabilities, and an epic showdown with a final boss to wrap the whole thing up in a neat little bow. While Zelda didn't invent dungeons as a gameplay concept by any means, it has consistently been at the forefront of their evolution for a very long time now, inspiring countless IPs in the process and even giving rise to entire genres for that matter. Which is why it's such a shame to me that out of all the things they could have taken a hatchet to in the last two games, they decided to add dungeons to that list. Because, let's be fair, while the shrines can be fun in their own way as little micro-challenges, dungeons they most certainly are not. If anything, they feel more like the secret stages in Mario Sunshine. A small, self-contained trial where some of the freedoms you enjoy in the overworld are taken away temporarily. As for the Divine Beasts, they were a novel concept which was unfortunately repeated one too many times, and overall, they're still a bit too short and small to meet my dungeon criteria. Not to mention, they suffer from the same problems as the shrines do. Low enemy variety, a repetitive look and atmosphere, and a bit of an over-reliance on physics-based puzzles. Even Hyrule Castle, which many have praised as the only true dungeon in Breath of the Wild, still lacks that ingenuity seen in the previous titles. You can also skip almost the entire thing if you want to, because there are no locked doors or keys to collect, nothing that halts your progression or forces you to explore other sections of the castle first. It's all optional, and while optional stuff can be a great thing, the unfortunate downside is that developers tend to minimize the effort that goes into it, since there's a very good chance that players will ignore or miss out on all their hard work, so it is understandable. While the castle is one of the best places to explore in the entire game, you do see some of those cut corners here and there. When you reach the castle's lockup to get the Hylian shield, for example, instead of fighting a completely new boss that is unique to this specific area, you are instead fighting the same overworld boss you've already seen a million times by that point. I do understand the praise it gets, and despite all my yammering, it might just be my favorite iteration of the castle in the entire series. But I wouldn't go as far as to call it a replacement for the dungeons of old, because mechanically it's still pretty basic compared to some of the stuff that came before. Which brings us to Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons, and well, they're sort of a hybrid between the Divine Beasts and the castle, which may sound like a great idea on paper, but we'll get into that in a moment. As far as improvements go, they are a lot more varied in terms of their aesthetics, atmosphere, music, and especially the bosses, which were pretty abysmal in the previous game. I would even rank some of these boss fights among the best in the series. They're big, they're bombastic, the music is just fantastic, and some of them, like Queen Gypto, actually put up a decent fight. At their core, the dungeons in Tears are for the most part just the Divine Beasts again, except this time without the central mechanic where you control parts of the dungeon, which was like the one thing the beasts had going for them because it was something fresh and new. They do have their own little quirks, you know, the Wind Temple has air currents and ice, the Fire Temple has minecarts, the Water Temple has low gravity, and the Lightning Temple makes use of light beams and mirror puzzles. But it just isn't enough to compensate for their shortcomings in my opinion. They suffer from a lot of the same issues as before. They're too short, the enemy variety is still way too low, treasure chests rarely hold anything of value, there's no mini-bosses, no mind-blowing mechanics, and no backtracking of any kind. Not only that, but because they borrow from two different concepts, the beasts and the castle, they not only inherit problems from both, they even lack some of the advantages they have over each other, which can sometimes result in getting the worst of both worlds, as opposed to the best. For example, they have the static nature of the castle, but not quite its scale and complexity. In fact, many of them are closer in size to a divine beast than they are the castle. They feature the same style of progression as the beasts, where you activate terminals in any order, but not their constraints, and instead allows for the same freedom and open-endedness you have at the castle. Everything you have at your disposal in the overworld, you also have access to inside dungeons. Zonai devices, climbing, ascend, everything. Meaning you can often circumvent puzzles and even entire sections of a dungeon quite easily, making an already short dungeon experience even shorter. This issue isn't as pronounced when you don't have the tools and resources to pull it off, but these aren't exactly hard to come by either. The path to auto-build is revealed in the first settlement you visit after reaching the surface, and Zonai capsules are also not exactly difficult to get your hands on. On the first playthrough, most people take their sweet time with games like these, so unless you're absolutely bum rushing your way through the main story, I'd wager that many players will be in possession of at least most of these resources before they get around to their first story dungeon. And the fact that many of these aren't designed with these types of exploits in mind is rather baffling to me. It's the lack of constraints that is really one of the biggest culprits here, and you can't really blame people for taking advantage of this. Because yeah, why would I fiddle around with minecarts and physics puzzles when I can just fly over there and save myself the time and effort? Experience dictates that if you give a player the option to abuse the system, more often than not, they will. Now, I won't deny that sometimes it can be very satisfying when you feel like you've outsmarted the level designers in a way, but there is a limit to how far you can take this before it starts to break the experience. Of course, I am aware that there's always been glitches and exploits in practically every Zelda game, and there's an entire community devoted to breaking the system and beating the game as fast as humanly possible. But stuff like glitches not only take time to be discovered and mastered, they weren't intentional, whereas the Zonai devices are accessible by design. Nintendo's new design philosophy is heavily centered around player freedom and being able to go wherever, whenever. I get that. But I think this is one instance in which they are being a bit too overzealous with this new philosophy. It's been shown time and time again that artificial constraints can lead to some amazing gameplay experiences, even in an open world with near limitless freedom. Eventide Island, for example, is often hailed as a fan-favorite moment in Breath of the Wild. And guess what? It takes away your armor, your weapons, your ability to save, and if you leave before completing the mission, you lose all your progress. And yet everybody loves it. Some of the most memorable shrines are the ones who place artificial rules on you. When used at the right moments and in the right places, restrictions can be a great thing, and I think Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons would have benefited from this too. Now, I will admit that in the past I was a big advocate of not taking away freedoms and instead designing a dungeon around these abilities. But that was long before I knew we were gonna have access to hover bikes and springboards that launch you 50 feet into the air, or strap rockets to your shield. I mean, there's only so much you can account for, you know? That being said, there is one dungeon that manages to avoid this issue altogether, the Lightning Temple, and I will give credit where credit is due. The Lightning Temple was pretty awesome. It has some of the best puzzles, one of the best bosses, and I just love the atmosphere of this place. It actually feels like you're exploring an ancient tomb of sorts, Indiana Jones style traps included. And because of its more closed off and claustrophobic nature, the climbing and zonai devices don't pose an issue here. Even ascend is kept in check because the structure is shaped like a step pyramid. Thus, the opportunity to cheat puzzles and circumvent obstacles is negligible, as more often than not you'll just emerge on top of the pyramid. In part because of this, it also feels considerably bigger and lengthier than the other dungeons. And as it stands, the Lightning Temple is the only one that truly felt like an old school Zelda dungeon to me. Some may feel the same way about the Stormwind arc, but not me personally. Granted, the zonai devices aren't as big of an issue here either, though you can still use them to cheese some of the exterior sections, but again, credit where credit is due. The way the arc is designed does discourage cheap tricks, since the intended method is often just as fast, if not faster. I also want to say that the lead up to the arc is genuinely amazing, and one of my favorite moments in any Zelda game to date. Witnessing that silhouette light up above you as you scale the island chain, and then diving into the eye of the storm, it's incredible. That said, once you actually set foot on the arc, the magic does take a bit of a nosedive, and it just ends up feeling like a watered-down version of the sand ship from Skyward Sword. But without the time shift mechanic, the cool mini-boss fight, basically everything that made that dungeon so unique and memorable. Even the Lightning Temple, despite all of its strengths, does still suffer from some of those issues too. While it is my favorite dungeon in Tears by a mile, it still wouldn't crack my top 10 favorite dungeons of all time list, because in my eyes, it still falls short when compared to contemporary dungeons like the Arbiter's Grounds from Twilight Princess or the Spirit Temple from Ocarina of Time. Speaking of the Spirit Temple, the one from Tears of the Kingdom that is, after going through it a couple of times now, my overall impressions have changed ever so slightly. During my first playthrough, I hated it, but in hindsight I've come to realize that this was partially my own fault. See, the first time I arrived at the Construct Factory, my experience was soured by the fact that I didn't realize it was a dungeon, mainly because it doesn't have a dungeon map like the others do. In fact, I thought I was still in the lead up to a dungeon, similar to the Zora Waterworks or activating the light towers in the Gerudo Desert. Because up to this point, the pattern was you meet your companion, you complete some story missions for them or with them, you traverse the overworld together, and then you get to the dungeon proper. But no, this is the dungeon, or at least part of it. So I think you can imagine my disappointment, because when you finally get to the Spirit Temple and see that mysterious building rising out of the darkness, you get all excited like, ooh, now we're getting to the good stuff. You take the elevator and descend into its interior, only to realize that, oh, it's just one room that serves as a boss arena, that's it. I'm not gonna lie, this is where I almost shut the game off in sheer frustration. It just felt so demoralizing, especially considering that for most people, including myself, this is the last dungeon they'll find themselves in before the endgame. But again, I admit it, I set myself up for disappointment by not realizing the Construct Factory is part of the dungeon experience. And now that I know going in, I've gained a bit more appreciation for the factory. It's the only dungeon that actually mixes up the whole activate the terminals gimmick they've been recycling since the previous title. Instead of simply activating 4 or 5 static thingamajigs spread across the area, here you have to transfer the 4 body parts from room to room, and ultimately back to the main plaza for assembly. It's also the only place where the overabundance of Zonai devices actually feels justified. After all, it's an ancient Zonai factory. It makes sense that there would be an emphasis on finding and using all this old technology here, the same way the mining facility in Skyward Sword had an emphasis on technology and timeshift crystals. The factory does have its flaws. There's no enemies to fight inside the depots, for example, and the ones that hang around near the plaza are so easy to avoid that they may as well not have been there. The road leading to the depots can still be skipped very easily, and overall it still amounts to a pretty short experience. But these issues pale in comparison to the second half, where you have to make your way to the Spirit Temple. Now, I get what they were going for here. The idea of operating a mech and blasting your way through hordes of enemies is a great concept, but the execution here is not that amazing. Minoru's construct just feels way too sluggish, her damage output is pretty underwhelming even with fused weaponry. Zonai attachments like flamethrowers and cannons will last, I don't know, maybe about a minute before they disappear again. And to make matters worse, she drains your battery not just when using Zonai attachments, but with every step she takes. She might just be the most inefficient mech in the history of mechs. So guess what I did? Yep. And this works, by the way. You can just fly past every obstacle all the way to the Spirit Temple without any resistance. And when you get there, Minoru will just magically catch up with you in less than 30 seconds. You may have to make 1 or 2 stops on the way there, depending on how much you've upgraded your battery by this point, but it sure beats stumbling around in this thing. That said, the boss fight, while nothing too special in terms of strategy, was pretty fun though, especially because it's something we've never seen in the series so far. Overall, the experience as a whole is okay. It has some good moments which I failed to appreciate on my first playthrough. As a final dungeon, however, it is still a little disappointing, especially considering that in many Zelda games, the last dungeon you clear before heading to the antagonist's lair or castle or whatever is often one of the best ones. But I don't feel that way about the Spirit Temple, unfortunately. As for the Water Temple, what is there to say except we don't talk about the Water Temple. Just pretend it doesn't exist and it can't hurt you. Joking aside, I think most people agree that it's the worst dungeon, not just in Tears of the Kingdom, but the entire series. I mean, who thought it was a good idea to put a water temple up in the sky? Especially considering that the Zora waterworks are right there. Had they made this place bigger and more complex, it would have been a perfect fit for a water-style dungeon. It's located underwater, for starters. It has a great atmosphere. In fact, it kinda reminds me of the Lakebed Temple from Twilight Princess. It even has better music than the actual water temple. And since the game doesn't have underwater mechanics like some of the previous titles, the rising water level would have served as a decent central mechanic too, as it would dictate which areas of the dungeon Link can access at any given moment. But no, instead we got this. A place you can literally clear in under 15 minutes. Finally, we have Gloom's Lair, and honestly, I don't have all that much to say about this place. I would even hesitate to call it a dungeon, since it's pretty much a straight shot to the finish. There's no locked doors, no branching paths worthy of mentioning. I don't even think there's a single puzzle to speak of. There are some pretty tough enemy encounters on the way, but you can also ignore a substantial amount of them, which I would argue is actually the better option since you'll save your weapons and resources for the final battle. It's a far cry from practically everything that came before, including Hyrule Castle from Breath of the Wild in my opinion. Ganon's Lair is supposed to be your final test, a culmination of everything you faced up to that point cranked up to 11, but Gloom's Lair fails to deliver on that front. If it wasn't for the boss rush at the end, the intimidation factor would be next to 0. I do like the music and the atmosphere, as well as the theme of descending further and further down into the earth, but when I dove down into that hole where Ganondorf disappeared to during the opening, I was really expecting more than just a single hallway that leads straight to Ganondorf's front door. And it's a shame too, because the actual fight with Ganondorf and everything that follows is absolutely stellar, and a top contender for the most epic and climactic finales to any Zelda game thus far. I'm not joking when I say this stuff right here is top tier, 5 out of 5 stars, masterfully done. So how awesome would it have been if this sequence was preceded by a brutal, lengthy, intimidating final dungeon just like in the old games? It really feels like a missed opportunity. This is gonna sound a lot more harsh than I really mean it, but while they didn't scratch that dungeon itch for me and are far from being flawless, I still respect the Divine Beasts because here it felt like there was a true vision behind it, you know what I mean? They were based on these Japanese mechanical puppets, a real-life hobby of Aonuma himself. They wanted to make them feel more like actual characters who inhabit this world as opposed to just a lifeless building, and they were never meant to serve as classic dungeons. As such, criticizing the beasts for not feeling like a true Zelda dungeon feels a bit like criticizing a car for not being an airplane. The dungeons in Tears, on the other hand, were clearly meant to be more like the dungeons of old in a way, so I can't really excuse them in the same way. They just don't feel as focused. In fact, I kinda get the feeling that the developers simply said to themselves, what if we just took the Divine Beast concept and copy-pasted it onto a building or a ship or whatever? I mean, it's kinda like a classic dungeon, right? But the result is an experience that is about as short-lived as a Divine Beast, if not shorter in some cases, and almost just as repetitive despite the more varied aesthetics. I mean, the fact that I was thrown off because one dungeon ended up doing something slightly different than the others kinda speaks for itself. In that sense, it doesn't matter that they all look different, because with the exception of the Spirit Temple, the rules are exactly the same in each one. Thus, once you clear one dungeon, you know exactly what to expect moving forward. You know going in that you're gonna be activating terminals in any order, that you'll find a boatload of Zonai devices to solve physics puzzles with, and that there's gonna be 3, maybe 4 enemy types, all of which you've already seen in the overworld. No unexpected NPC encounters, no unusual events that change the dungeon halfway through, no mix-ups beyond the bare basics. Now, I do appreciate that they listened to at least some of the feedback of its predecessor and made dungeons look more distinct, and they definitely have some redeeming qualities, but ultimately they just fall short on too many levels, which makes them feel more like a step backwards, whereas the Divine Beast felt more like a step sideways, if that makes any sense. That being said, I do think I understand why these dungeons are the way they are, and I do not believe it's because the Zelda team stopped caring or lost their creative spark, as some people like to suggest. I'm sure some of it can be attributed to a shift in mindset and priorities, but I also suspect that a lot of the issues lie with the new engine. Because when you think about it, for the first time ever in the series, dungeons have been fully integrated into the seamless open world. Thus, they are not only forced to abide by the same rules as the world at large, they had to be retrofitted into the landscape, and so their physical presence, size, and geometry actually matters this time around. The old dungeons didn't have these limitations since they exist on a separate map hidden behind a loading screen. They can be as big and complicated as the developers want them to be. They can be any shape, have their own rules, and spatially they don't have to make any logical sense since they don't take up any actual space in the overworld. Some of the mechanics we've seen in the past would be much harder to achieve in a game like Tears of the Kingdom, where almost everything is interconnected, than it is in a game like, say, Majora's Mask. On a separate map, you can bend the rules much more easily without having to worry how it will affect areas outside of that space. And there are signs that the developers were struggling with this. In various interviews about Breath of the Wild's development, the Zelda team shared stories about how even a minor tweak to the physics engine in one area would cause all sorts of anomalies in other parts of the map. Furthermore, during a recent panel at the GDC, we heard similar stories about Tears of the Kingdom's development, that the freedom Ultra Hand offers caused all sorts of chaos across Hyrule during playtesting, to a point where they had to ditch all non-physics items and basically make everything physics-driven, even something as simple as gates. The new engine is incredibly impressive, but it's also very sensitive, to a degree that certain things the series has been doing successfully since the 90s have now become a bit of a programming nightmare, it seems. Ironically enough, the act of granting the player near limitless freedom and a seamless world to explore actually has a bit of an inverse effect on the freedom and creativity of the level designers, since they are juggling with so many more variables than they used to. I mean, it took them a full year just to refine the Ultra Hand physics, so I can only imagine how difficult it would have been to also make them compatible with underwater physics, or reverse gravity or something. Granted, the engine doesn't account for every issue, like the weak enemy placement and enemy variety, or the lack of mix-ups in terms of progression, but I think it does explain a lot of the other shortcomings. And honestly, I don't know what the solution would be if there even is one, and I'm genuinely conflicted on it. On the one hand, I think it's really cool that dungeons are an actual part of the world now. The fact that I can not only view surrounding landmarks from inside a dungeon, but also go there without so much as a cinematic or loading screen. Or the idea that right behind this wall is an actual space which I can seamlessly access, and it's not just a hollow shell. But on the flip side, if it limits what the level designers can do in terms of mechanics and creativity, then I'm not so sure if it's a worthy trade-off. Now, obviously, they're not going to ditch this engine anytime soon. They've poured so much work into it, it's likely going to be the blueprint for the foreseeable future. And perhaps the solution is as simple as needing more time to expand on the engine and create workarounds. But let me know what you think, because I am curious how others feel about this. Next, let's briefly talk about the companions. I will start off by saying they didn't really bother me as much as I thought they would. After the Wind Waker, I was kind of dreading the day that they would try something like this again, but they definitely handled it way better here. You don't have to waste 20 seconds playing a song just to take control of them, you can't lose track of their position, they just kinda do their own thing. If anything, I think my biggest issue with the companions is that they feel way too underutilized. In games like The Last of Us or God of War, this kind of stuff works because the entire experience is built around these characters working together. Their interactions, their companionship, character growth, all that jazz. The same can be said about party-based RPGs and D&D type of games. Having companions with you is like a key defining trait of that genre, and they all serve practical purposes both in the story and in particular during combat. But in Zelda games, it tends to feel tagged on, because you're not really interacting with them all that much outside of cutscenes and the occasional gratuitous remark here and there.
Alright, 3 left.
Yeah, I know I do. I can count.
And since dungeons are so short, there just isn't enough time to really bond with these characters. And before you know it, they're gone again for most of the game. Like I said, they feel remarkably underutilized and underdeveloped, which isn't helped by the fact that a lot of sage abilities either have alternatives, which are sometimes faster and more effective, or sections that require their abilities can easily be skipped altogether. Even the bosses can be dealt with without their involvement, which can sometimes make for a better challenge, while other times it actually makes the boss easier in a way. You'd be surprised how effective bomb arrows can be against Queen Gipto, or splash fruit arrows against Mukturok. I do get why they did this, since if you go straight to Ganondorf without awakening a sage first, you'll have to face their corresponding dungeon boss without them. In other words, they had to be designed in a way so that Link is always capable of taking them down by himself. So when you think about it, if it wasn't for the terminals, like say they could be activated in a similar way to Breath of the Wild, then the sages would have very little reason to exist aside from story implications. I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess that I'm probably not the majority opinion on this, and that's okay. A lot of people do seem to enjoy the cooperative gameplay, and aside from the few times that they obstruct the camera view, they don't really get in the way of the experience, which I think is the most important thing an AI companion can do. Now, before we move away from Tears of the Kingdom and finish up with some more general points, I want to make it clear that just because I'm criticizing Tears of the Kingdom's dungeon design doesn't mean that I'm not open to change, or that we have to go back to the old ways completely, because there are aspects about the new dungeon approach that I prefer over the old formula, and would love to see carried over to whatever comes next. For starters, I like that certain puzzles have more than one solution. That feeling you get when you solve something in a way that probably wasn't the quote-unquote intended method is priceless. A lot of the puzzles in the older games were pretty stock and left little to no room for experimentation. You had to do them in the exact way the developers intended, or else it just didn't work. Again, there is a limit to how far you can take this in my opinion. Using a hover bike to essentially skip 50% of a dungeon is a bit too much. But for the more self-contained puzzles, I think alternative solutions should definitely be a mainstay. I also think that being able to tackle dungeons in any order is a good thing. I used to feel different about this, but after 2 games where you can choose where you want to go first, it's grown on me quite a bit. And going back to a linear dungeon order again will probably feel a bit regressive. I know it does have its downsides like difficulty scaling and narrative progression, but I'm sure there are ways to solve these issues in the future. If anything, A Link Between Worlds already proves that a linear story and a non-linear dungeon order can coexist. Speaking of A Link Between Worlds, while I would love to see progression items make a return in future Zeldas, instead of giving you all the tools you need right at the beginning, the Lightning Temple has convinced me that you don't always need them to build an effective dungeon, and I think progression items can exist without completely falling back to the old approach. In previous games, dungeon items basically serve as glorified skeleton keys. Before you obtain the item, about half of the dungeon is inaccessible, and once you find it, the dungeon opens up to you, and it just becomes a matter of remembering the areas you couldn't access previously. Even to an old school Zelda fan like me, this setup did start to feel a little bit stale, so I would love to see more mix-ups between the old and the new in that regard. Maybe some dungeons do feature a progression item, others do not. Or the item isn't found inside a dungeon and can instead be borrowed or purchased somewhere, like in A Link Between Worlds. With all that said, let's wrap things up with 2 final points. First and foremost, I'd like to see more environmental storytelling in Zelda Dungeons moving forward. Again, this is not a critique of Tears of the Kingdom specifically, because while there isn't as much lore to be found in these areas as I hoped there would be, the same can be said about a lot of dungeons from the older games as well. I mean, there's a reason why places like the Forest Temple, Snow Peak Ruins, the Ancient Cistern, and the Arbutus Grounds are much more popular topics for lore videos compared to many other dungeons in the series. It's because, intentional or not, there was a real sense of mystery here, and clues to piece together a compelling backstory. But when it comes to the majority of Zelda dungeons, a lot of them border a little too much on just being a video game level, which is fine for a game like Mario, but narrative-driven fantasy games like Zelda benefit if the world has substance, and dungeons should not be an exception. I am aware that Nintendo has a gameplay first type of mentality, but I am of the opinion that if it's possible to inject some kind of story or mystery into your level design, you definitely should, because it makes whatever the player explores or traverses 10 times more memorable and intriguing than if it's just a random collection of walls and assets. It keeps people talking, and thus it bolsters long-term interest and discussions long after the game has already run its course. I'm actually planning to make a whole video about environmental storytelling and why it's so important, so keep an eye out for that in the future. And finally, I want to quickly address something that's been floating around in discussions here and there. It revolves around the question if dungeons should continue to be a core part of the Zelda formula to begin with. This is not a new question, in fact it's been a topic of discussion ever since Breath of the Wild's success. A game which technically didn't feature dungeons yet still managed to become a fan favorite, including one of my favorites by the way. The way I see it, it kinda depends on what you as an individual look for in a Zelda game. Tears of the Kingdom does have a lot of dungeon-like content alongside its story dungeons. It has caves, wells, the labyrinths, and of course the shrines. And so, if the question is all of this content put together a worthy replacement for the dungeons of old, then I would say no, because they lack the variety, scale, and ingenuity that I look for in a Zelda dungeon. However, someone else may say yes. For me, this is enough to compensate for bigger dungeons. And you know, I can respect that. Not everyone enjoys the time commitment that comes with dungeons like these. Some people may not have a lot of free time, and so bite-sized challenges like the shrines will fit their busy lifestyles a lot better. Which is why I made it very clear in the introduction that I don't want to take anything away from anyone. I do believe, however, that it's possible to satisfy both camps on this matter. And yes, I do think that both camps are equally relevant in this discussion. If you were to ask the fanbase as a whole what they like most about Zelda, chances are you'll likely receive many different answers, and dungeons will be among those answers too. I'd wager a fair amount in fact, since it's been a cornerstone of the formula for a very long time now. To me, removing or downscaling Zelda Dungeons is like taking Paper Mario and removing the XP, the leveling up, the party-based battle system, and who would be stupid enough to do something like that? Anyway, what I'm basically trying to say is that one doesn't have to be sacrificed over the other. Issues like time restraints can be solved with frequent checkpoints, or being able to save on the spot and pick up where you left off later on, which I'm pretty sure is already possible right now that I think about it. Also, both big and small dungeons can remain completely optional from now for all I care. I would even go as far as to say that the big ones don't even have to be attached to the main story, because that's not what I play dungeons for. I don't care if there's a major plot development at the end or a big story reward. I just want to fight a variety of enemies, solve puzzles, find cool treasures along the way, slowly unravel the structure's layout, and ultimately, after many hardships, face off against a monstrosity 10 times my size. I got some of those things from Tears of the Kingdom, but not nearly as much as I personally hoped for, and the elements that were there felt more like a watered-down version of it. Of course, the future of Zelda isn't about me or what I want, and it's not something I'm gonna be losing sleep over or anything. If Tears of the Kingdom's dungeon style turns out to be the new standard for the foreseeable future, I can make my peace with that. I will still enjoy the games in different ways, I will still make videos about them, and I can always get my dungeon fix from somewhere else. But I would be lying to myself if I didn't say, man, would I love to see the masters at work again and show everyone how it's done. It would be incredible. As always, a big thanks to my amazing supporters on Patreon, my awesome channel members, and of course everyone else for watching. In the next episode we'll be discussing the future of Zelda's combat system, so I hope to see you there. Until next time, and have a good one.